The SAB is one with unlimited potential. A company whose influence and impact reaches beyond our breweries to impact our communities, our country, and our economy. Here's to rising up, you and I, a new SAB. Looking forward to what lies ahead. True African leaders dreaming big to create a future with more cheers. In step with our government and partners, with a blueprint to expand our business and transform our economy and grow our country. Here's to investing in and growing our brands and reputation, differentiating and elevating beer in order to create an environment where we will lead and grow the category with an unwavering commitment to championing responsibility. Here's to harnessing the power of technology by leveraging our growing digital platforms to drive revenue and seamless connection between our retailers and consumers, and doing what we do, but better. Here's to putting our money where our dreams are, evolving the business to meet the challenges of the day, and investing to ensure the transformation of our logistics and supply capability in a changing world. Here's to putting our best foot forward for growth like South Africa has never seen before. Cheers to dreaming big, a dream that we will make a reality.
Good? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today as we discuss all things beer. We promise that it's going to be a jam-packed session and lots of interesting conversations. For those who don't know who I am, my name is Zoleka Lisa, and I head up corporate affairs here at SAB. And my role today is to be your program director as we navigate the program this morning. But before we get into the meat of the agenda, I really do want to recognize all the guests and partners who've joined us this morning. We do have in our presence members from the city of Ekurhuleni. We are joined by the MMC of Economic Development, Ms. Nomadlozi Nkosi, and she is representing the mayor of Ekurhuleni. So thank you very much, Mama, for coming. We appreciate it. I do also want to thank all our value chain, our industry, and our business association partners for joining with us. As we always discuss things beer, you are always part of that process. We have at the back the leadership of Alrode Brewery and of our supply chain organization, and they are the real hosts because they are the brewers, and they make the golden and magic liquid that many of our consumers love. And last but not least, a very warm welcome to all our media partners. It's really humbling to have a media community that takes interest in what happens in the beer world and shares it with the millions of South Africans. So a little bit around why we are gathered here. As beer, we are a very local, natural, and inclusive product. We care about our communities, and we're a part of the economy. So we created this annual State of the Beer Economy as a platform for us to really deep dive on the state, the health, and the happenings within the beer industry, and to really ensure that we're talking about what's happening in South Africa and what we are doing, not only as beer, but as big business, to be a part of that transformation. So we'll explore a range of socioeconomic factors that influence our category, and hopefully you walk away from today having learned something new about the world of beer. I'd like to tell you a little bit about this brewery. You've traveled a bit far. We've left the fancy streets of Sandton to bring you all the way to Alrode. Alrode is indeed one of our largest breweries. It's the largest producer of our 750 volume products. So the quart, most of it comes out from this brewery, not only in South Africa, but just across the continent. It's the second largest brewery in terms of capacity. We're an employer. This particular brewery employs just under 600, in the region of 590. And in seasons where we have to scale up, we flex up with resources, and 40%, and MMC, I think this is important for you, 40% of the resources when we flex up come right here from Ekurhuleni. So we make sure that we drive the local employment and economic activity. On an annual basis, we're investing over 100 million rands in CapEx projects, could be anything that happens at the brewery, to ensure that we're also driving projects execution. So without further ado, I think it's time to kick off, and I'd like to invite MMC Nkosi to tell us about the importance of big business in the local economy, and of course the impact that breweries plays in this particular market. Over to you, ma'am.
And everyone in attendance, good morning, colleagues. I'm honored to stand here in front of you and welcome you to the City of Peace, the City of Ekurhuleni. Firstly, I need to apologize on behalf of the Executive Mayor who couldn't join us here today because he would have attended the National SALGA Members Assembly that is underway at Bedshoot Hotel. Now, Program Director, it is a known fact that beer is one of the most loved choices of drink in South Africa. This is the case on so fronts as people enjoy this beverage on varying occasions, whether celebrating, unwinding, or just feeling somber. What excites me most about the success and far-reaching impact this industry has is the reality that it contributes immensely to the country's economy. This we witness in the growing tax revenue collected from beer's consumption and over 100,000 jobs created by this sector. Program Director, on that positive note, I proudly say cheers to socio-economic impact the SAB continues to bring and make in South Africa and in Ekurhuleni. You know, as government, we always encourage corporates to partner with us in making the lives of our people better. The continuous growth of SAB beer consumption is great news to all of us. It means growing input in lives of many, the process of educating many of our children through those salaries they pay. With those few words of welcome, I'd like to say cheers to the growth of cold beer's reputation and plowing back to our own communities in Ekurhuleni. We really appreciate you, and we say in Ekurhuleni, you are one of our own. The revenue that you bring to us, the job creation that you bring to us, you are one of our best, and we, as the City of Ekurhuleni, want to continue working with you, want to partner with you, and you are one of our own, and you are all welcome to the City of Peace. Thank you.
So first up, I would like to call up our first speaker of the morning, Ms. Lynette Ellis. She is a consulting economist at the Bureau of Economic Research, also known as BER, and she'll provide an overview of our current macroeconomic environment and also unpack our recent elasticity study. Over to you, Lynette. Thank you.
Right, good morning everybody. It's great to be here today. SAB kindly invited me to give an overview of the findings that the BR got on the price and income elasticity for liquor and beer in South Africa, and also just to give an overview of the outlook for consumer spending in South Africa. Oops. There we go. Okay, looking at the macroeconomic environment facing the consumer, the COVID-19 pandemic led to a record 6% decline in real consumer spending in the year 2020. It took the South African economy 2 years to recover back to the pre-COVID level of consumption, and this recovery was largely driven by two factors. The one is the cuts in the prime interest rate, but the other one is also a surge in social grants expenditure. However, unfortunately, these positives started to fade and to reverse over the next couple of years, and recently we've seen soaring inflation and interest rate hikes erode the purchasing power of consumers. Fortunately, there is some good news, there is some light at the end of the tunnel, so I will discuss that a little bit later in the presentation. The second part of the presentation, sorry, just struggling with this, that way, there we go, sorry. Okay, the second part of the presentation will relate to the findings that we had on the price and the income elasticities for the liquor industry. And there one of the key findings was that consumers' sensitivity to beer price hikes have actually increased over the last decade. Okay, turning to the macroeconomic environment facing the consumer, we can have a look at the graph there on the left-hand side. The orange line shows how total employment crashed by 10% during the COVID-19 pandemic. The quarterly labour force survey shows that South Africa lost 1.7 million jobs between 2019 and 2021. And that saw the unemployment rate increase from 29% at the end of 2019 to 35% at the end of 2021. Subsequently, the unemployment rate has come down to 32.6%, but we're not quite back where we were before COVID. Now, the blue line on the graph there shows what happened to real disposable income. And you can see that the contraction in real disposable income, 4.8%, was significantly less than the contraction on employment that we had during COVID. So real disposable income was actually underpinned by these interest rate cuts, a 300 basis point cut in the prime interest rate, and then also the rollout of the 350 rands a month social relief of distress grant. Now, looking at the social relief of distress grant, we can see that this was introduced there in 2020, and it took the total number of social grants beneficiaries in South Africa up from 18 million people in 2019 to 27.5 million people this year. That's almost 45% of the South African population now receiving a social grant from the government. The National Treasury estimates that about 8.6 million people will receive the SRD grant this year, and they value it at around 36 billion rand for this year. Now, even though that 36 billion is quite a significant portion of the income of the very low income group, it is only 0.8% of total disposable income. But because the low income group spent the bulk of their income on food and beverages, we believe that the food and beverage industry was actually one of the biggest beneficiaries of this new social relief of distress grant. Unfortunately, this 350 rands a month value of the social relief of distress grant has not been increased since it was implemented in the year 2020. And also, if we look at the 2023 adjustments by the National Treasury to other social grants, such as the child support grant or the old age pension, those adjustments were about 2 percentage points below the CPI inflation rate. So that means that in real inflation-adjusted terms, the spending power of social grants beneficiaries have really declined over the last couple of years. Now, talking about inflation, the graph there on the left-hand side shows how the CPI, and especially food prices, surged during 2022. The good news is that recently we've seen a more broad-based deceleration in the CPI inflation rate. The CPI peaked at 7.8% in July of last year, and it has now come down to 4.7% in this July. Food and non-alcoholic beverage inflation is down from a peak of 14% earlier this year to 9.9% in July of this year. If we exclude food and non-alcoholic beverages, which has this very high inflation rate, if we exclude that from the CPI, the rest of the products increased by 3.7% year on year in this July. So that's a little bit of good news for the consumer. Now, apart from that, the inflation that is slowing, we're also seeing wage hikes playing a bit of catch-up. So Andrew Levy estimates that collective bargaining wage settlements increased by 6% last year, which was below the inflation rate of 6.9%. And they think that this year it will increase by between 6 and 8%, which is above our forecast of the inflation rate for this year of 5.8%. Also, the government implemented a 7.5% wage hike in April of this year. So that means in real terms, the real wage is starting to recover and will continue to recover over the next 12 months. In another bit of positive news, after 475 basis points of interest rate hikes, we hope and believe that the South African Reserve Bank came to the end of their hiking cycle in May this year. We see the interest rate remaining on hold until about the second quarter of next year, and then we expect to see about 125 basis points of interest rate cuts through the remainder of 2024. So that will, of course, help the durable goods consumption in particular. Now, just to summarize things, the South African consumer is really under significant pressure this year still, but the outlook is a bit better for 2024 and 25 on the back of lower inflation, higher real wages and interest rate cuts. We also expect to see at least an inflation-linked increase in social grants next year, including this time around the social relief of distress grant. So that would be good news for the lower income groups. And then also, as you know, we've seen a surge in green energy projects at the moment, and that should lead to some less load shedding next year. That could lift our GDP and lead to some job creation in 2024 and 25. And then lastly, next year, March, we will also see the introduction of a two-pot retirement system where pension fund members will be able to withdraw and spend a portion of their retirement savings from about March next year. And that is also expected to boost especially the durable goods spending in South Africa. Now, the table there shows the BR's forecast for some of the key macroeconomic variables that impact the consumer. You'll see that we've got real disposable income at only 0.7% growth this year, but then picking up to 1.7% next year and 2.2% in 2025. Real consumer spending, we've got at 0.9%, which is just slightly above the disposable income growth. And the reason for that is that consumers, especially the high-income consumers, are still drawing a little bit on their savings. They built up some savings during the COVID pandemic, and they're still drawing on that savings to sort of keep their living standards up while the economy is under so much pressure. Then from next year, we see real consumer spending increasing more or less in line with real disposable income growth. Then that blue line there shows the strong recovery in food, beverages, and tobacco sales volumes over the last couple of years. You'll see that last year we had 4.5% growth in food, beverages, and tobacco sales volumes on the back of obviously the economy opening up. We're free to buy liquor whenever we want last year. And also the social grants expenditure that was quite strong. But this year, the BR forecast that food, beverages, and tobacco sales volumes will decline by 0.5%. And the reasons for that is, number one, the very high food inflation that we're seeing. And then also, like I've explained, the increases in social grants has been below the inflation rate. So that hurts the spending power of especially the low-income groups. Then for the next couple of years, that food, beverages, and tobacco sales volumes can improve to closer to 2% growth in the outer years. So that concludes my projections on the consumer spending outlook. So next, I would like to discuss the BR's findings on the price and income elasticity analysis that we did for SAB. So this latest study that we conducted was, in fact, an update of this econometric study that we did for SAB in 2010, where we also measured the price and income elasticities of the liquor industry. In the 2010 study, we used the 2000s as the sample period. This time around, the sample period was between 2013 and 19. We purposefully excluded 2020 and 21 because obviously the strict lockdowns distorted liquor sales volumes during those years, and that would have adversely affected our findings. So we used the same econometric techniques between the two studies, but of course the economic backdrop has changed over the last 2 decades, and that resulted into somewhat higher income elasticity readings that we had previously, and also a higher beer price elasticity reading that we had in 2010. Looking at the income elasticity, the 2010 study found very low income elasticities for the liquor industry. If we look at that graph on the left-hand side, it shows real disposable income growth, which averaged 3.7% per year during the 2000s, which is quite a high rate of real disposable income growth for South Africa. But during that time, we actually had a proliferation of new consumer products and services, such as laptops, cell phones, mobile data, the internet, gambling, even the lotto was introduced. So these new consumer products and services actually attracted a greater share of consumer spending at the time, and that then translated into a low income elasticity reading for the liquor industry. During the 2010 study, we found the income elasticity for total liquor to be between 0.6 and 0.7, and the income elasticity for beer to be between 0.4 and 0.5. So that means during the 2000s, a 1% increase in real disposable income only translated into about a 0.5% increase in beer sales volumes. Now, what's happened in the latest sample period, you can see the graph shows that real disposable income growth actually slowed. During the sample period, it was only 2.4% per year. And also, these new products that I spoke about, they sort of started to grow at slower rates. They started to stabilize from growing at these very high rates. And that also led to a normalization in the income elasticities that we measured for total liquor and beer. You can see that in the new study, the income elasticities for total liquor and beer came in at around 1%. So that means if real disposable income increases by 1%, then beer sales volumes will also increase by 1%. Obviously, the converse is also true. So if disposable income declines, we are going to see a proportionate decline in beer sales volumes. At 2, the income elasticity of flavored alcoholic beverages is still quite a bit above the income elasticity of beer and other liquor products. So on the flavored alcoholic beverage side, we've seen a lot of new product launches, a lot of new pack sizes launched, and this category has been growing at a much faster rate than real disposable income, and hence we see that higher income elasticity for FABs. Then the study also found that the price elasticity of total liquor remained broadly unchanged at minus 0.75 between the two studies, but the price elasticity of beer actually increased from minus 0.7 to between minus 0.85 and minus 1. Now, there's a couple of reasons why we believe beer has become more price sensitive over the last decade. Firstly, there's been an increase in competition within the liquor industry. So the graph there shows that beer's share of the liquor market by volume declined from 77% in 2011 to about 71% in 2022. And at the same time, we saw market share of wine, spirits, and especially flavored alcoholic beverages. The fact that there are now more competitors for beer, that means that at the beer price and becoming a little bit more price elastic. Then we've also had high real beer price increases over the last decade. So that means that, not only did beer prices increase at a higher rate than the CPI inflation rate, but it also increased at a faster rate than the other liquor category price increases. So beer has become relatively more expensive and is demanding a little bit bigger share of the consumer's wallet, and that will also make the consumer a little bit more price sensitive to that product. Then finally, we've also seen income growth slowing, which means that consumers' budgets are a little bit more under pressure, and that would also make them a little bit more price sensitive. So in the latest study, we find that a 1% increase in the beer price over and above the CPI inflation rate would typically lead to between a 0.85 and 1% decline in beer sales volumes. The price elasticity for flavored alcoholic beverages declined slightly from minus 1.25 to minus 1. When we did the study in 2010, FABs was still a smaller category, growing very quickly. Now it's a little. Then just to summarize, the consumer has been under real significant pressure, taking strain from inflation and interest rate hikes this year, and we think it's going to be very tough for the next 6 months. Consumer sensitivity towards beer price hikes have increased. But there is some light at the end of the tunnel. And that should also aid the liquor industry. Thank you.
Really put some pressure on consumers' wallets, and we are seeing that in terms of the food, beverages, and alcohol sector. And then thirdly, I think your studies around elasticities has shown that consumers are increasingly sensitive around beer price. So that's something I think is quite an important to take out for a number of us in the room. Up next, we've got Boris, who is our CEO, and he's going to share on the back of Lynette's presentation what's been happening not only in our business, but how we've been experiencing the economic environment as SAB. Over to you, Boris.
Working. So good morning. Welcome, MMC. Welcome, everyone. Thanks a lot for making the time. I know we're all busy, and Alrode's a great place to have a brewery, but not easy to get to. So I have a few slides here. I'm going to focus at the end on the good news, but let's just talk about beer quickly. We've been talking about beer as a natural product. Beer has been made for thousands of years, right? It's a completely natural product, normally made from 3 real ingredients: malted barley, hops, and water with a bit of yeast. And the great thing about that is it means that it becomes a very inclusive product for your economy, right? It's a product that we make in South Africa. 95% of everything that goes into a beer that SAB makes is sourced locally. So from seed, from the farm, to the manufacturers, to the logistics companies, to our local breweries. We have 7 breweries across the country. This is obviously one of them. It is very inclusive for the economy, and it's inclusive for the country, right? Everyone likes, not everyone, but lots of people fortunately like to celebrate occasions like weddings, etc., by having a beer. And as I said, it's very local. It's local in that it touches all parts of the country, and it's local in that 95% of everything that goes into a beer that SAB makes comes from South Africa. And the beer industry, so this is the full industry, is a big contributor to economic growth in South Africa. We did this research about 18 months ago now, I think, just to understand the contribution that beer makes to the South African economy and jobs. So you can see here 1 in every 79 rand of GDP comes from beer. 1 in every 66 jobs comes from the beer value chain. That's a total of 250,000 jobs in South Africa that are supported by the beer industry. Now, that's a very significant number. The global average across markets across the globe is 1 in 110 jobs. We would obviously love this number to be 1 in 110 because it would mean more people in the country have jobs. But the reality is, with the economy where it is and employment where it is, beer is over-indexing in terms of its contribution to jobs in South Africa and has a very important role to play in driving employment. And then we've contributed 43 billion rand in tax across the industry every year. And that number is obviously very important. And we realize as an industry, the complete alcohol industry, the importance of us paying significant tax. We appreciate fully that alcohol does create harm if not consumed responsibly. And we understand that what is called sin taxes, excise taxes, are a very important part of the fiscus, and our contribution to those is something we take seriously and understand it needs to happen. We'll just talk quickly about, today is really about the state of the beer economy, the importance of having policy certainty for us as an industry as we move forward in what Lynette explained is a very tough time for us as an industry. And the benefit of having consistent policy implementation results in a growing industry, right? And I'll talk about SAB specifically. So we've announced in the last 2 investment conferences investments of almost 12 billion rand into South Africa, right? This is off the back of 2 almost inflationary increases in excise taxes, a fairly stable policy environment for us to operate in, which gave us the confidence to operate. It allowed the industry to grow over the last 2 years. And with growth comes the requirement for more capacity. And we needed capacity. There are 2 examples here. One, our brewery in Ebai, in Gqeberha, and the other in Prospecton in KZN. Investing in increasing the capacity of those 2 breweries, investing almost 2 billion rand into the breweries, and you can see the job impact of those investments. Combined, almost 40,000 jobs being created as a result of the expansion of those breweries. When we expand a brewery, we need more farmers to grow more barley, more maize, more hops. We need more transporters. We need more people to work directly in the brewery. We need more retailers to sell the products. The knock-on impact of a growing SAB has a significant impact on jobs in the country. And this is something we take very seriously. We need to grow, but we also need to grow responsibly whilst reducing alcohol harm. I've touched on this, but we support a thriving agricultural sector. You can see we source maize and barley across the whole country. We have supported over the last 5 or 6 years 1,120 black emerging farmers. The beer industry supports directly about 38,000 jobs just in agriculture, and so a very important contributor to the overall agriculture sector within the country. And then beer and FABs. FABs, for those who don't know, flavored alcoholic beverages are things like Brutal Fruit, Flying Fish, Savannah. So very similar in their nature to beer. Typically a low ABV product sold either in a glass bottle or in a can. You can see that this is total industry numbers, and these are SAB estimates. These numbers aren't publicly available, so but they will directionally be accurate. But between beer and FABs in the country, full industry, we support 50% of glass manufacturing. All right, the MMC from Ekurhuleni is here today. Ardagh Group recently acquired Consol. So the Consol is obviously the glass manufacturer that everyone knows well. They have a massive facility here in Ekurhuleni, several facilities, in fact. Isanti Glass is a black-owned glass manufacturer that SAB partnered with the black industrialists to acquire from Nampak just before COVID. That's also based here in Ekurhuleni. And so you have two very significant manufacturers in glass. 50% of their output is sold into beer and fabs. And within cans, obviously there are a lot of cans used in soft drinks as well as the food industry. So it's, we think, more than 30% of all of the cans that are manufactured locally are required by the beer and the fabs industry. Why is this important? It's important because these are big industries, big companies with very big supply chains of their own that require the industry to be healthy and ultimately growing in order to drive growth, create employment, drive tax revenue. But the reality is, and I'm not telling anyone anything they don't know already, but it's been a tough start to the year, right? We've seen our consumers squeezed, high interest rates, high inflation rates, high fuel costs, high unemployment. That's the South Africa we live in today. We all know the reality. But the impact it's had on the total alcohol industry for the first 7 months, you can see there, is an approximate decline in volumes of 5%. This is a very material number for the alcohol industry. Typically, the alcohol industry will grow in line with population growth, legal drinking age population growth, and GDP growth as a general rule over a long period of time. For the industry to decline by 5%, it's going to put enormous strain across the full value chain. So from the farmers to the manufacturers to the retailers, in fact, even to some of the alcohol manufacturers are going to be required to make some very difficult choices. And so we're in a very difficult point right now within the industry. And you can see, just to highlight, everyone, the common knowledge is that, no matter what happens, people will continue to drink beer. The industry is defensive. It is very resilient. But the truth of the matter is that in a constrained economic environment, we are seeing, as you can see by the decline of 5% in the industry, we are seeing consumers make the right choices, right? Consumers are choosing to put food on the table. They're choosing to pay the higher taxi fare or transport costs to get to work. And as a result, they have less money to spend on alcohol, and that's absolutely right in this environment, right? Consumers are making the right choices, but it is impacting our industry. And so far, year to date, what we've seen within beer, you can see a long-term growth rate of almost 2%. That reflects roughly GDP growth and the growth in LDA, drinking age population. But you can see this year that growth is arrested, and if the momentum continues, potentially could even go into decline. So just in conclusion, there's, I think, thanks to Lynette for pointing out the green shoots. We do believe as an industry that a lot of the bad news, if you will, is kind of priced into putting consumers under strain. It's much more likely that interest rates are going to come down than go up. Inflation is already coming down. Hopefully the fuel price can come down, but we're not too sure about that. And we saw some very early green shoots on unemployment, but we need to work harder fixing the electricity grid to drive employment in the country. So we do believe they're green shoots. But today really is about saying we need, as an industry, strong policy certainty around excise tax. We know that the government is under pressure from a budgetary perspective. And speaking candidly, for 10 years, we've seen at times massively inflated excise increases when they're compared to inflation. that's against policy, and that really hurts the industry. And the point I'd like to leave you with is that right now, with the industry declining, with consumers under pressure, the industry cannot afford government to walk away from the policy, which is an inflationary excise increase, and effectively kick an industry that's really struggling right now, and an industry that's super important, not only to Ekurhuleni, but to the whole country. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're not going to do them now. Thank you, Boris. Just some brief takeouts. I think it's quite clear that we are an industry under pressure, and I think this notion of tax policy certainty is really resonating right now, more so with demand-side pressures, as we're seeing with our consumers, and their wallets being under pressure as well on the supply side with the high input costs. So it is a very interesting time in the beer world. I do want to unpack a couple of things we've been thinking about. And as a big business, forward planning is something that's quite important for our business. And that's why major policy shifts are quite disruptive. We need to provide certainty internally as well to our value chain, as well as externally to our consumers, etc. So one of the questions we've been asking ourselves is, can the government actually test whether they could give tax policy certainty to our industry? So for example, could they introduce a 3-year outlook on excise adjustment? We've seen it happen in other countries. We've seen it happen in other sectors. So we are providing a solution to something we think could help our industry. And with certainty, we can make decisions, make investments, etc. So I would like to invite a very esteemed panel to help us unpack and explore this discussion. First up, we have Mr. Dawie Root. He is the Director and Chief Economist at the Efficient Group. Dawie is an economist with over 30 years' experience, and he specializes in government finances and monetary policy. We also have Mr. Oleboheng Ramatlhodi. He's the Indirect Tax Leader for Deloitte South Africa. Ole has been a director for over 10 years with extensive global trade advisory as well as consulting experience. We also have an industry ally, Mr. Lucky Ntimani. He is the convener of the National Liquor Traders Association and is an important voice for township businesses and works with over 30,000 taverners across South Africa. And last but not least, we have our very own senior manager in excise and tax policy, Ms. Fitsani Banda, who also is a qualified economist. So Fitsani and panel, over to yourself. Does everyone have a mic? Okay, so let's see how. Thank you. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today to have a conversation about tax certainty in this economic environment. I think I just wanted to. Shall I use a handout? Let's share. Okay.
Are we ready? Let's go. Okay, thank you everyone for attending. And I think this is supposed to be a robust discussion around excise tax certainty. Just dialing in the last 2 points, closing up. We have a tough macroeconomic environment. We have consumers that are obviously feeling the strain of some of the inflation that came through last year. But I just want to give some people an idea of what exactly excise tax certainty looks like for SAB or as a manufacturer in the alcohol industry. So what happens on budget day is that we wait with bated breath for the announcement of the excise adjustment. Manufacturing business, bear in mind, with 7 breweries across the country. We have 30,000 customers, a logistics network of over 300 truck drivers, waiting to see what exactly the excise adjustment would change to. And why this is important, because our stock on the day of budget is at one rate, the old excise rate, and we have to wait and hear what the Minister of Finance will table as the new rate. So everyone, pens down, machine down, has to listen and recon the old excise stock and then stop everything to recon again, start machines up, and take into consideration the new excise rate. A lot of pressure for an alcohol industry that obviously has such a big economic footprint across the country. But Dave, I just want to speak to you in particular and just dial in on this, the system where we wait with bated breath as a value chain and as a manufacturing business as to what exactly the excise rate will be. Is this efficient? Have you seen this in other countries? And I know you have expertise around tax systems. What exactly do you perceive of our current operating environment with regards to certainty?
I listened to you. We spoke about it yesterday, and you told me you have to stop all the machines, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, this is not very efficient. This is a huge cost to your business, and one of the requirements of a good tax system is that it should take account of the cost and the effort that business have to go through in order to pay all these various taxes. Perhaps I can just make a very important comment here, and I've listened to Lynette. Of course, that is important to understand what's going on in the economy, but we have to understand the fiscal accounts, and Boris referred to that as well. The fiscal accounts are in very deep trouble. Let me repeat that. The fiscal accounts are in extremely deep trouble. And the Minister of Finance this year and in a couple of years to come, there will be two priorities: to get more money in and also to spend less money. And he's already started that process. But some of the requirements for a good tax system certainly are things like, for example, as cost effective as possible. Fairness is a very important point of a good tax system, as an example, and I know that the excise duties are not very fair in South Africa. And of course, there are some other things that need to be included as well in the tax system, like, for example, what is the certain social and political objectives that the whole tax system has in mind. When you refer specifically to excise duties, I think it will be much easier for excise duties if you knew before the time what the changes in excise duty should be. For some weird reason, the Minister of Finance, there's this huge secrecy around the budget. But I simply do not understand why that is the case. And in fact, a good economist that can analyze the budget will be able to determine what the Minister of Finance is going to say to a large extent in the budget itself. And another suggestion from my side, so less secrecy. Another suggestion from us certainly will be to somehow link the increase in excise to something else. Like, for example, the CPI. What link it to CPI? And everybody knows what the increase is going to be. And beforehand, you can actually make all your adjustments. And you don't need to switch off your machines, as well as what you've indicated. I simply cannot believe that a tax like this, and I'm not an expert in excise as such, could be so disruptive. I was actually quite shocked.
Yes, and I agree with you. It's actually quite disruptive for a manufacturing industry to have to shut down our 7 breweries and restart them again. But I really want to give Olebogeng a chance to speak about tax policy certainty. I know you have an experience or an outline really of how indirect taxes play not only to the fiscus, but how industries really experience them. We have the fuel levy, we have the environmental levy, as well as the excise levy. Do you think, given the interaction you've had with industry and government, that tax policy certainty is prioritized? And how has that looked like from your lens, having seen how government actually implements it and how industries experience it? How exactly can this tax principle be applied in a most effective way?
Thanks, Fatsani. I think the funny thing about the conversation that we're having today is the fact that summits in and summits out. The conversation around regulatory certainty at a much broader level has been happening for many years, and because of that, one is surprised by the fact that we're still having conversation around tax certainty. Everybody's in agreement that tax certainty does two things. One, it encourages domestic investment, as well as attracts foreign direct investment. And then the question is why then do we not have much more certainty around some of the taxes? If I bring it back home to South Africa, if you look at the direct side of our tax management system, there has been a lot of certainty that has been created over the years. But for some reason, when we talk about indirect taxes, that level of certainty is not prevalent. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And I think generally these type of taxes are considered to be big revenue generators and government generally wants to leave the door open for them to make certain adjustments so that they make up for financial year similar to the one that we are in, where projections are that we're going to land at between 80 and 140 billion rand from a surplus perspective. But I strongly believe that there is a way in which we can provide tax policy certainty, even within the framework of opening up doors for us to continuously leave the door open for us to adjust taxes. What I've seen markets such as Europe and the US doing is they would link the excise duty adjustment to things like, if the economy is doing well, they would hike them. If the economy is not doing well, they would lower them so as to encourage consumer spending, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think that there is an opportunity for us as a country now and hopefully in the next MTPPS to start relooking at the way that we determine excise policy, so that at least there is that level of certainty in terms of what are we linking excise duties to, so that you don't have to stop our operations around the 20th of February. So that you don't have to have questions around whether I should be investing further in the business or not. And I think that level of certainty not only would be conducive for not only for your industries, for all other industries in general. And I think we'll then start seeing more and more revenue being generated by multinationals and locally, born companies. And that way, taxes on profits and wealth and will then result in us, for once, reaching our revenue targets and being able to spend accordingly in terms of our fiscal policy.
Thanks, Zelebogeng, for that. I just want to dial in on something that you said in particular, that we should increase taxes during periods of high economic growth and subsequently relook at what exactly do we do with our tax instruments in tough times that we're experiencing right now. We haven't necessarily returned back to pre-COVID levels in terms of economic growth as manufacturing industries. So what to do with taxes when you need the growth, more fundamentally, to sustain the fiscus, because the fiscus does well when economic growth is actually increasing and doesn't necessarily put too much pressure on tax instruments. So I really want to dial in on that economic growth aspect and just have Lucky come in on really giving us a sense of the downward value chain in our beer industry in particular. And we usually talk in a very macro way around the fiscal and the macroeconomic environment, and we essentially forget the small guy, the small and medium enterprises that actually are at the coalface of some of these real consumer sensitivities. Just give us a sense of how exactly, and just a recap essentially of what exactly our economic footprint is in our taverners and our downstream value chain, and give us a sense of really what is going on. How is the consumer facing some of these sensitivities and some of these pressures arising from the macroeconomic environment?
Thank you for the opportunity. I was worried a bit there that we'll have to answer about excise duty. It's a big topic for taverns, but we're trying to grapple with it now and then. Thank you for this opportunity. We are really grateful to South African breweries for continuing to have these conversations. We sensitize and almost bring us in line with the economic realities of our country. But it also helps us that we are able to come together with a manufacturer that has supported taverns for over 100 years, and we are grateful for this opportunity. So if you look at taverns, at a high level, pre-COVID we were 39,000. Now we're sitting at about 42,000, and we employ on average about 4 to 5 people that work in our establishments. So in the immediate, we have about over 200,000 people that are dependent on our sector as taverns. And if you take in the owners who are generally the managers of these establishments, and we have the economic participation of about 250,000 people at any given time at a tavern. And during peak trading periods, which is over the weekend, so between Friday and Sunday, we sell alcohol worth over 70%. So that is our peak period, and we're able to bring in extra people to help with packing crates, collecting bottles from the tables. But we also have the value chain, those people that are able to pick up bottles over the weekends from our establishments. And the value of that, as per the conversation that I had with the chairman of it was Consort Glass back then, was that it was equivalent to about 500 million, right? Just that value chain. And we have abo mama selling amagwinya, chicken feet around the corner, who are dependent on the tavern being operational. So if you look at a whole value chain, emanating from a tavern space, you're looking at close to 1 million livelihoods that will be dependent on this space. But also importantly, and that's why we're always very interested to have this type of conversations, that beer makes up 80% of what is sold in a tavern. And almost 70% of that is mainstream. And mainstream is provided or is sold by South African breweries. So for us, South African breweries is what brings people into our establishments. If we're to stop in a day to sell mainstream products, no one will come to our taverns. So we understand that this is our base. Hence, we are supportive of this type of initiatives because they're not only aimed at pursuing an agenda for one company, but it is something that is very important for the country as a whole, given that the alcohol industry is actually a key employer, especially in a township economy where we operate from. So the issue of tax for us is something that we want to engage in insofar as how it affects our business. And now we have load shedding, where we're not able to sell cold beverages. We have high fuel prices, which means that even those that were able to invest in buying generators are not going to be able to actually even operate those generators because now the prices are out of reach for them. But also, even if your tavern is all set and well to be able to deal with these current economic challenges, no one's going to walk in Alexander 13th Avenue to come to a tavern at 9 o'clock at night because you have a generator. They have to deal with the issue of crime, which is a reality in our country, where they have to walk from the house into our tavern. So we are facing a myriad of challenges as a tavern sector to be able to remain sustainable. We're a resilient sector, but I think now we're being asked to deal with too much, and we are struggling.
What I take out of what you said, Lucky, is that there's a lot of micro operating issues that are coming out of the tavern environment, a multiplicity of them, heavily dependent on manufacturers being able to sustain themselves. And that's the core and the bloodline of the taverners in essence. And there's really a big complementarity between what happens in the manufacturing sector and what actually is experienced by the taverners. And sometimes that is missed in the conversation around what's going on in the macroeconomic environment, particularly with generators and trying to keep the lights on and trying to keep your stock cold. I think that's a very fundamental and grassroots conversation around what really is happening when we see the coal-face front of essentially our beer value chain. But I just want to go back to Davi around this policy environment and the talks essentially about an excise policy review in our space in particular. The last time it was reviewed was almost 10 years ago. You would have imagined that the environment has changed quite significantly in that regard. When you look at reviewing tax systems and the concept of when is it time to redesign? When is it time for principles to be relooked at? We've spoken about tax certainty and some of the frustrations we've had essentially because it's a very tough economic environment. Can you give us a sense of some of the red flags or the factors that you would think are necessary to consider in spaces when we say, look, it seems like it's time for policy review, but how do we, in essence, ensure that it is prioritized when we are experiencing some of the bottlenecks right now with the tax certainty lay of the land as it relates to excise?
Like I've mentioned earlier, the Minister of Finance's emphasis certainly will be not on having a good tax system. His emphasis will be to get as much money out of the system as he possibly can. That's where the emphasis is because of where the fiscal accounts are. I just want to make a comment about what you said earlier about lowering taxes in a bad economic environment and increasing it in a good economic environment. That is in fact happening. It's called the so-called automatic stabilizers. When economic growth slows down, companies pay less taxes. And the fiscal deficit opens up, for example, and the opposite happens when the economy grows and that's indeed where we are currently. We are running a fiscal deficit probably in the region of about 6% or more to GDP at the moment, which is highly expansionary. So the fiscus in South Africa is actually highly expansionary, while monetary policy, what the Reserve Bank is doing, is actually contractory. So these two policies are moving in opposite directions. Coming back to your question about the tax regime or the tax system, one of the, like I've said earlier also, one of the requirements for the tax system is fairness, of course that's one, but simplicity. You must have a system that is cost effective in getting money in because that's one of the reasons why you have a tax system. But there's another requirement for a good tax system, is so-called neutrality. But that is exactly that unneutrality or the nature or the fact that excise duties are not neutral, politicians use that to discourage people to drink, in this example as an example. Now, I've got some suggestions that I think are actually quite possible to implement. One suggestion that I can think of, we can completely scrap excise duties in South Africa and replace it with a differentiated VAT system on certain products only. If you look at VAT, we have 3 VAT rates in South Africa already. We've got a 15%, we've got a 0, and we've got a nothing. And there's a difference between a 0 and a nothing. I'm not going to go into that. But there has been talk about increasing VAT on TVs and more luxury goods, for example. So if we do, and that's not the ideal thing to do, but if we want to do that, then we can, for example, increase an additional VAT level of 17%, argument's sake, on certain products like, for example, beer or cigarettes or whatever the case might be, and scrap excise duties completely. But there are some other factors that we need to keep in mind as well. Of course, recent research on consumption patterns, that's something that you have to keep in mind to see how consumption changed the past 10 years. You have to look at certain new research, like, for example, in the case of alcohol or so-called sin taxes, on research as far as health research. The World Health Organization recently brought out a couple of recommendations on taxes as an example. But for me, very, very importantly, you must try to simplify the tax system, because the expensive and a complicated tax system puts a huge cost on companies to calculate all of that. And we want a simple, easy tax system, and a simple, easy tax system is also a system that's much more difficult to evade taxes.
Got it. Absolutely. Tax simplicity is one of the, I suppose, principles that's been forgotten amongst trying to collect as much revenue as possible, is that the administration part must also be effective. And I just want to give Olivering an opportunity to dial in on that simplicity. Given that we've asked quite clearly for an outlook, a 3-year outlook, and we've seen countries like Zambia and Nigeria impose that on their excise systems, do you think that's possible to provide an easy breakthrough for manufacturing industries like SAB to know in advance? Do you think that's administratively possible to give an outlook? And why do you think there'd be an opportunity not in the policy space to hold that back or have reservations? I think there's obviously an efficiency call coming from Davi around that. But do you see any grassroots shoots around having real conversations around improving the administration, not only on the SAR side, but also for those that have to comply with the tax system? Do you think there's an opportunity in the policy space in that regard?
Thanks, Fatsani. I do think that there is definitely an opportunity for a much better level of engagement between the private sector as well as government. I mean, I've had the privilege of sitting in the public sector for about 3 years, at the Revenue Authority for that matter. And the one thing that I picked up in engaging with the industry from a SARS perspective was the level of trust that we had when we were engaging with business. And a lot of it emanates from the fact that sometimes industry is not as willing to share around the dynamics that drive production, profits, etc. And then on the flip side of that, industry worries about the confidentiality around the information that they provide, what SARS is going to do with the information, or government at large. And I think that level of mistrust between the public sector and the private sector has led partly to the situation that we're sitting with at the moment. What can be done about it? What has happened over the past couple of years, at least from a SARS perspective, since Edward Kieswetter joined SARS, is that he's pulled a lot of individuals from private sector, and us as a private sector have pulled a lot of people out of the public sector. And I do think those are should be the conversation starters around how do we then best collaborate as government and the public sector? Because if you think about it, we all are part of the same coin that talks to how do we make lives, the standard of living for South Africans better than it currently is. We all worry about the level at which the economy is performing, etc., etc. So we are all fighting the same battle, but for whatever reason, we're not trusting each other in that type of fight. So long and short of what I'm saying is that there is definitely an opportunity for us to have a frank conversation around how do we then better support government when they running dry from a revenue perspective, and how do they then in return support the industry and make sure that we create jobs, we further invest in the economy, et cetera, et cetera.
And rightly so, I think collaboration between government and the private sector has always been important. And also, I think, in understanding what bottlenecks or weaknesses there are in the tax system, that becomes critical. Because without that conversation, and we haven't had an excise policy conversation for 10 years, you can imagine that there must be miscommunication or misunderstanding of how the government sees things and how an industry like ourselves experiences the excise tax system. And I suppose having regular reviews and commentary around the effectiveness of a system also improves the simplicity and the certainty and the fairness. And I think having those regular conversations and the forums for that will actually tie back quite closely with the efficiency and effectiveness of an excise tax system in particular. But I want to get back to the consumer, Lucky. And we've heard that consumer is really tight. The wallet and inflation has really affected how much purchasing power they have. How exactly is that showing up in the taverner's environment? How exactly are small and medium enterprises seeing the consumers? How is the traffic in that regard? And I really want to dial into this grassroots conversation in particular around, yes, we saw the BR present the high-level stats, but give us a sense of what the consumer is actually experiencing as they interact with the township economy, and how challenging it is to get the sort of traction that we need to really say taverners are sustainable and they can continue as business as usual without any recognition of the tough economic times.
It's a tough one. I think maybe taverns can be better positioned if we had bricks every week in South Africa, because at least we know we have electricity. It is extremely tough now. If we look at the recent fuel hikes, and we're talking about it with David, that now the increase at a minimum for a taxi fare will be R1 per leg. And most of our people use about 4 taxis to go to work. So you're looking at about a R4 increase per day. And if you extrapolate that to a month, then it's a higher amount. And those are the very same people that must come and buy alcohol from our establishments. But also, they knock off at 5, they get home around 6, 7 o'clock, it's dark, there's load shedding. So we remain with the stock in our fridges. And those of us who can afford to have generators, you remain with a cold stock, and also the price of fuel that you've put in a generator. And you have no one coming to you because you now have 5 hours or 4 hours or so of not having electricity. So people are not going to come and support you simply because you have a generator. So the economic realities that we experience in South Africa are not helpful for our sector, though it is a very a resilient sector, but it's a two-way stream. We can provide the beverage that our consumers are looking for at the temperature that they're looking for, and we have invested in that, and actually even provided security for them to be comfortable at our establishment. But for them to be hit in the pockets means that we remain with the environment and the real estate ready to serve our consumers, but they're just not going to come. And those that come means that the load shedding schedule favors them. But as soon as then the electricity switches off at 8 o'clock, they're going to leave. And actually, they've now become expert in terms of determining when the electricity is going to go out. So if it's going to be 8 o'clock, they're not going to risk it and wait for 8 o'clock to leave. They're going to leave early because there's still light and they can make it home safely. So we don't know where to run to, but the challenges are so many. We are grateful that our consumers, those that are brave enough, continue to support us. But for us, we want to provide an environment where they are safe. And we are not comfortable that they have to walk in the dark, and there's nothing we can do about it. But we continue to appreciate the support that we get. But we'll continue to do our part and play a meaningful role in society by supporting the very same jobs that are carrying us. So you will never hear a situation where a tavern is retrenched, because the jobs, we have a close relationship with people that work in our environment. If the tavern is not busy, then we'll find some jobs within the environment for them to do, so that we can keep the economy going. We just feel that government, should do better. This load shedding thing has been going for a while now. But we're not the only ones who are complaining. All sectors in South Africa are affected. But for us to keep on, doing what we do best, which is to sell alcohol in a responsible way, support our families, and also appreciate our consumers that come and support us going forward.
Absolutely. I think it's a very tough environment. And missing, and obviously I mentioned this earlier, is some of the small and medium voices around this. We have so many reports and we have so much data around this macro story, but to hear the human story of how exactly people are experiencing, I mean, there's no way nobody's going to walk in the middle of the night to obviously say, look, I need to go and support my regular, my neighbor or whoever it is down your street that has a business and you would like to support them. But the challenges of load shedding in particular have obviously affected the operating environment. And I think that's something that needs to be prioritized in general as we talk about some of the consumer issues, is that also includes getting to the venues and obviously how they can equip themselves with generators and the likes to keep the lights on. And I think that's something that we need to continue to have on the table. But I just really want to dial into something that, Davi, you mentioned about the hard revenue outlook to date. And we've seen 4 months worth of revenue collection coming out from SARS. And the same question I would pose to you, Olebogeng, is we've seen to date over 32 billion rand worth of a gap between what was estimated in the budget in February and currently where we're at now. One of the conversations is around what tax instruments are going to fund this deficit? Should we look out? Should we borrow money? Or should we try and maximize the tax yield? I know early on in this year, the commissioner spoke about this compliance dividend that he could still continue to maintain or at least bring into as revenue collection. Do you think additional pressure can be put on tax instruments such as excise in a very uncertain macroeconomic environment? As Lucky pointed out, we have fuel increasing at higher than expected, tough consumer conditions. Should there be a prioritization around economic growth, for instance, and for how long? Or should we get the quick buck in and get it from increasing excise taxes? And obviously in a very tight economic environment that has multiplier effects. What are your insights based on your data and experience? What does that look like coming from the data you've seen come out?
I listened to Lucky and the comments he's made, and what you're referring to, all the problems that you've pointed out, is actually what economists call structural problems that we have in the economy. That's a typical example of that. And I'm looking at the economic numbers, that's exactly what we see as well. Look at the second quarter, for example, household consumption expenditure was actually a negative growth. So that households are taking huge strain in South Africa. What are those kind of taxes that we can look at to fill that gap? Now, let me give you just an overview on the major taxes in South Africa. The most important revenue source to the Minister of Finance is personal income taxes. That's by far the biggest one. And the problem is it's a very narrow-based tax. You can't increase that, but those guys are immigrating, they're leaving. And you can't really increase that anymore. I just want to make a broad comment, firstly. The redistributional impact of the fiscus in South Africa is probably the highest in the world, which means few people pay just about all the taxes and a lot of people get a benefit from that, assuming the state is effective and efficient, which is not the case. We've got a highly inefficient state in South Africa. But the most important one is personal income taxes. The second most important one is value-added taxes. The third one is company taxes. Number 4 is the fuel levy, and then a number of other taxes. In the case of excise duties, the contribution of excise duties is around about 4% to total revenue of the state, and the excise duties brings in less than 60 billion annually. The shortfall in revenue in total this year is going to be between 50 and 100 billion. This is a big number we're talking about here. But that's primarily in the corporate and company side because the commodity cycle has been under pressure. So if you want to get more money in, the easiest way to get more money in is to increase value-added tax. But to increase value-added tax, that's politically extremely difficult to do. You can increase a couple of smaller taxes like excise duties, for example, or maybe some import duties or whatever, but it's not really going to make a difference because we're talking small amounts of money in any event. Even if you double the excise duties, it will not be enough to fill this gap that is left by the commodity cycle, the slowdown in commodity cycle. So the best that we certainly can do is to try to make the system easier, more efficient, and in the end, the only answer to all our problems is economic growth. And I'm afraid with the structural impediments that we have, the kind of macroeconomic policies that we have, which are in many instances completely wrong, and also the efficiency of the state. Those are issues that we need to address to get the economy to grow. There's no other answer. We can try to increase taxes, but that's not the answer. We need to cut back on state spending and improve the efficiency. And I'm afraid with the election around the corner, don't hold your breath yet.
The one thing that I'll say is that I don't like the idea of excise duties being increased. I mean, this past weekend I was at home visiting my parents, and I had gone into a alcohol dispenser and bought myself a pack of a beverage, and it cost me a lot more than I expected. So, no for me there. So, but I echo your sentiments. I think there is talk of South Africans being overtaxed from an all taxes perspective. Personal income tax, the high earners are, what are we now, 44%? Very high. The VAT rate is a no-brainer. It's not going to happen because next year is happening and years after that. Because the constituency that's going to vote for you is the one that pays the VAT, and they're unlikely to be happy with you if you increase the VAT. So that conversation out of the table, and many other taxes. So there is no option for the government to try and squeeze consumers more. And if you do that, it's likely going to be, as you were saying, at the level of the high earners who are, in any case, going to immigrate, and you're going to still be left with a revenue cap. What I think the government should be doing, and it's something that Edward Kisbeta was speaking about when he joined, but because of the economic boom, from a commodity prices perspective, that focus seems to have shifted because we are celebrating the fact that we're making revenue targets. It's around the concept of a tax cap, right? When he joined SARS, he was estimating it to be at about 10% of the revenue collection. If our revenue collection is 1.7 billion, you're sitting with 170 billion. My view is that we need to improve our enforcement efforts from a SARS perspective, while at the same time ensuring that we are not impacted negatively from a trade facilitation perspective and encouraging business to grow. That, in my mind, is the only place where you can try and do something about it. Because from a taxes perspective, there's not really much space to move.
May I add to that? Yeah, I don't disagree. I just want to say is that the confidence in South African government and in the South African economy is quite low. It's the lowest ever at the moment. And if you really squeeze the taxpayer, we all have to pay what we have to pay. But you run the risk that the relationship, that people's confidence in the government will be eroded even further. So no, I'm not saying you shouldn't be paying your taxes. I'm just saying if you, let me tell you the experience that I've had from the Netherlands recently. I've spoke to people that from the Netherlands. They were called by their revenue service. They were called by their revenue service, and the revenue service told them, if you adjust your taxes and put this here and there and whatever, you will be paying less taxes. Don't you want to do that rather? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? That's the kind of relationship that there should be between SARS and the taxpayer in South Africa, and that's certainly not the case.
Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely something, nuggets worth noting in the current context where everyone is looking, in particular the government, around ways to possibly sustain the fiscus, firstly. But I mean, in the long term, this economic growth has been persistent, and the talks about it, plans around it, the implementation around it, not so much, but it remains sort of an Achilles heel in the conversation around the fiscus is, are we really addressing economic growth? And I want to just get to you, Lucky, around the point that Davi made around structural issues. And what structural issues do you think taverners are unaddressed in really speaking about economic growth? I think Davi really dialed into the fact that there are supply-side issues that the government is supposed to be providing that really would bolster economic growth. And in essence, what the government is relying on are tax instruments, heavily so, versus really addressing economic growth. Do you think, and for instance, we've spoken about load shedding, is there something else in particular that you think needs to be addressed from the supply side on providing for infrastructure for taverners in particular that needs to be addressed quite constructively by the government that you haven't seen addressed in the operating environment of small and medium enterprises?
In our environment, maybe for those that might not be aware, so we have 9 different liquor laws in South Africa. So each and every province has its own liquor law. Like selling one product, but 9 different liquor laws. And then someone woke up in Limpopo on a sunny day and decided, that cutting 2 hours of trade per day is going to reduce crime. Right? So now what you're doing is you are saying that the on-site consumption must forego 2 hours worth of trading per day. The waiters, the waitresses, the people that are on an hourly rate must now forego that 2 hours worth of salary per day. And yet, you are the MSc of Economic Development, Tourism, and all of that, and you decide that those things are going to help fight crime without putting any facts on the table or maybe a scientific basis to back up such claims. And someone did it in Mpumalanga as well, woke up one day and said, no, 2 hours, going to cut, and then you guys will trade till 12. So what you had in Mpumalanga is that people would then drive from Mpumalanga to Limpopo, where they were closing at 2, right, to buy alcohol. So now, we took the government of Limpopo to court. So the judgment is out, we're just waiting for the written judgment, which then calls this move nonsensical at the very least. So the traders in Limpopo are going to trade till 2 a.m. And we're going to take the government of Mpumalanga to court, also to force them to fix the trading hours back to 2 a.m. And we're going to take every province in the country, including the national government, if they dare come close to our food.
Well, that's a strong note to end on the very tough, clearly regulatory environment. And it just goes back to the uncertainty, doesn't it? Some of these regulations, or in particular, and we're talking about excise tax certainty, but how difficult it must be to handle a policy environment where there is so much uncertainty and things happen without notice in very tough economic conditions. And I think a big roundup of the key takeouts I've taken from the conversation I've had with all three of you is, of course, it's a tough environment, but tax instruments and the use of them and the effect on consumers and the taverners and the use of really understanding how the tax system is working effectively and efficiently is heavily reliant on thinking through, firstly, the collaboration between the private sector and government, and thinking through whether there is an efficient application of the principles of tax, such as fairness and simplicity and, of course, certainty. So, and I think in every space, both at a macro level and at a taverner's level, there is an opportunity for both understanding regulatory certainty, but I think fundamentally, excise tax certainty is a conversation that needs to be prioritized, if anything, in particular as we look through some of the tough economic times and the revenue under collection, that perhaps putting pressure on small tax instruments such as excise in very uncertain global economic times may not be the answer. Maximizing on the compliance yield coming through from the commissioner is important, but also rethinking how much of the economic contribution we make as SAB, as the CEO has pointed out, but in particular, if we want to hold that economic contribution, certainty into the medium term over the 3 years would be key to creating that. And are we having enough of a robust conversation around that? This is meant to be a starting point, so hopefully this continues beyond this room. But I'd like to thank the panelists for sharing your insights, and we'll take them with us, obviously, into further conversations around certainty. Thank you very much.
Wrapping up our program, but before we do that, I really do need to call up our plant manager, Vishal Rambrayan, from the head of the brewery here, just to share a couple of things around what happens here at Alrode. It's true form of being a host. You have to say something about your home, and we can't leave without hearing about how proud you are of Alrode. So, Vishal, please do come up. You do have a couple of minutes, because after this, I'd like to take 3 rounds of questions, keep them very simple, short, and fast, to make sure that before our panelists leave, we've been able to address a couple of questions. Vishal, over to you.
Okay, good day, everyone, and welcome to Alrode Brewery. And this is who we are. We're the pride of Africa. Okay, and as you can see, we're quite a competitive brewery because I support. I think you know who, right? But we use this pub area that you're in to spend a lot of our time engaging our people and making sure that we also share not just in the work environment, but in the same pleasures that we share with our families. We are a family on our own as a brewery, and we therefore call ourselves the pride of Africa because anything and everything that you see that has been invested and grown in SAB has started here at Alrode Brewery. Okay? Quick question of where we operate. Most people would know that we're up here in Gauteng. And a brief history is that this brewery was built in 1965, called the Alrode Brewery, and we took it over in 1969. Thereafter, we bought shares within the Whitbread, and we used to be called ABC, which is Alrode Brewing Bottling Company. We're now called Alrode Brewery. And the main brands that we produce here is your famous Carling Black Label. We're the biggest producer of the 750 Carling Black Label, followed by Castle Lager, Hansa Pilsner, and Milk Stout, as well as Castle Light. Okay. From a capacity point of view, we make up about 134,000 square meters of land space that we take up within this brewery. And we pretty much have a built area of 74,000 that we use for actually producing our products, okay? We have these brands, like I said, and we're also famous for producing the Castle Light 340. That's one of the main brands that we manufacture here at Alrode Brewery, okay? So we're going to start the tour later on, so I'll spend some time with you around safety. As you can see, my get-up, all right? You're going to probably look similar to me when you walk the brewery. I would really appreciate if you stick to the safety standards when we're in the brewery and listen to the host, which is myself, when we go through. And if there's any questions you have, you'll be able to ask me along in the brewery tour. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vishal. Could I please ask Boris, Lynette, Ole, and Lucky to please come up? I will ask my colleagues to help me with mics for questions. Can we ask 3 questions in a round, break, and then the second one? Okay, so please raise your hand. I can come down. It could be faster. Please just introduce who you are and who you're asking the question to.
Okay, so I'm number 1.
You can have a seat as well, guys.
Thank you, colleagues. My name is Mtho. I'm the president of the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Firstly, congratulations once again on the lovely event. Thanks for the invite. We consider SAB as a very important company in South Africa, as you mentioned, Boris, about the value chain. But the question is to Lynette regarding the market share and the growth in the FABs. Because if you see spirits flatline and the others, beer has dropped, is that a consequence of the change in the profile of the beverage consumer? So younger people, female, is it a gender issue? Because I drink beer, but my wife doesn't like beer. And obviously anyone younger than me doesn't like beer. So is that a function of the change of the demographics? And also, are we likely then to see the consumption patterns changing? You know, because obviously, as you know, policymakers may still be the traditional beer drinkers, but the market is growing towards a younger and more diversified from a gender split point of view. Is that the true driver of the growth? And is that changing the consumption of beer and beverages in South Africa and obviously the future of the industry? Thanks.
Lynette, before you respond, can I just take 2 more questions and then we'll go into responses? So that, thanks, Mtho.
Sorry. Hi, Nick Wilson from News 24. A point of clarity just on the whole issue on excise duty. So is what you're saying, like every year basically it's a big surprise until budget day, you don't know what it's going to be. So you have to if you could just maybe, this is probably for you, Boris, talk us through? So do you stop production the day before, or how does it work? And then what was the most recent excise duty? So what you're basically wanting is for government to tell you, okay, this is what it's going to be over the next 3 years. Either do that or scrap it and then look at that.
One more question.
Hi, Arissa Shamrell from Netwerk 24. I just have two quick questions, one for Boris. What has the impact been on SAB of the acquiring, when Heineken acquired Distel? What did that overall impact on SAB and in the market? And then either for Boris or Lynette, if I look at the average price of a beer, by how much did that increase from before the pandemic to versus now? Am I paying R2 more, R5 more, R10 more? Thanks.
Okay.
Cool. So I'll jump in. I mean, I think taking the questions in order, the question around FABs, so flavored alcoholic beverages, just to remind everyone, that's Brutal Fruit, Flying Fish, Savannah, Bernini, are some of the big brands in the market today. What has driven that growth is two things. One is more female consumption, undoubtedly. So historically, there was spirits, wine, and beer, and there wasn't a big portfolio of brands that were attractive to females and the female palate in South Africa. So we've seen an increase in the number of female consumptions, undoubtedly. What's also driven the growth in this segment is innovation. So SAB, Heineken, Distel, all of the big manufacturers, Diageo, all of the big manufacturers in South Africa see this as a growth opportunity, and as a result have innovated very successfully over the last 10 years. And so what you've seen is the overall alcohol industry growing, as I mentioned earlier, more or less in line with population growth and GDP. But you've seen a shift out of beer, wine, and spirits into FABs. So FABs is growing, and FABs have been capturing the majority of the growth that we've seen in the total industry. So the total industry hasn't grown significantly. It's a shift out of beer, wine, and FABs, all three, into flavored alcoholic beverages. And so that is why you've seen them take share over time. Okay. Just Nick on the excise. To be clear, I think we're not advocating at all to scrap excise and replace it with VAT. I think I could bore everyone with why I think there would be a whole lot of complicated problems with doing that. I think that's not the answer. What we are saying, it's true that every year we have no idea until budget speech whether or not excise is going to increase by CPI. In some years, historically, 3 or 4 years ago, I think we received double CPI, right? Which was a massive surprise on the day. So operationally, it's a big problem, right? We need to stop, as mentioned, all the breweries. We need to recalibrate all of our systems. It's more the SAP back end, right? You need a clear break because you're paying one excise rate up to the budget speech, and immediately from the next day, you need to pay a new excise rate. So you need to stop production to give a clear indication of when you paid the old excise rate up until. You stop, you recalibrate all of the back end in terms of rates, in terms of how the systems calibrate the amount of excise we should pay based on the production of alcohol through our breweries, and then you start it again. So it is problematic. It is, people work overnight, and it is disruptive from a manufacturing perspective, right? That's an issue, but to be honest, if I asked to prioritize which was more important, I can live with one day's interruption if the conversation with Treasury was, we are going to give you clarity and certainty over, say, a 3-year period that we are going to increase excise at inflation through the budget cycle. And then there are lots of other things we should talk about making the system simpler, which is what I think we should do. So that would be much more important, because the reality is if you make plans, you set budgets, we have typically a 5-year, a 10-year, and a 1-year plan, right? So you think about the short term, the medium term, and the long term, always in business. And if you make plans, you need to understand what's happening from a pricing perspective, how that's going to impact volumes. We talked about elasticity earlier. You know, big price increases that come as a surprise impact the trajectory of the business, right? And you can make capital allocation decisions assuming one thing, and if something else comes, it can have a very negative impact on the business, right? And so what happens naturally, and this is true for every business in the country, in the world, right, is that if you think that there might be big surprises coming, you always err on the side of conservatism in terms of your capital allocation. The what if excises double the rates of inflation against policy? Okay, in that scenario, well then probably, you know, the prices are going to go up much more than we expected, volumes are going to come down, and actually maybe we don't need to expand the brewery in Prospecton. We don't need to create 25,000 jobs, right? Is the knock-on effect, the real knock-on effect of that decision, right? So the discussion we're having today is much more about the certainty of how excise is increased. I said it earlier, but I'll reiterate it. We're not here saying to scrap excise tax. We're not saying we don't expect excise to go up every year. We understand that if we sell more alcohol, we need to sell it responsibly, and we need to pay a fair tax for that, right? That is not the message at all. The message is, can we have certainty as to how that increase will be applied over the short to medium term? It'll make a massive difference to not only SAB, but the whole industry in terms of capital planning. And then, sorry, the question about Heineken and Distell, you'll have to ask them, right? So I'm on record as saying, you know, it's a combination of two very, very good companies with very, very good brands that is now under one umbrella and ultimately owned and controlled by the Heineken company out of Amsterdam. So the reality is we will continue to fight and compete in the market now with one company that will have a stronger route to market. We know the brands, we compete with the brands every day, but it will be a stronger company and will ultimately drive better competition in the market, which we all know will have significant benefits for consumers ultimately. So, yeah, the same great people, the same great brands, two great companies is now one good company, and yeah, but we're up for the competition. And sorry, you had a second question. Yes, what is the increase in price? We'll have to come back to you, but it's versus inflation, it's significantly above inflation, right? So we've had, over the last 3 years, on average, excise has been above inflation, not that much, but it has been above. But the bigger impact has been on input costs, right? So commodity boom, obviously aluminium, glass, everything we buy, the wheat price, the malt price, all of that commodity boom has put significant price pressure on our input costs. And as a result, we've had to pass on some of those price increases. So I would guess, and we'll come back with an accurate number, but I would guess in beer, probably 2 to 3% above inflation over the last 3 years. Yeah, so it's been a tough pricing environment. Yeah.
Last round, 3 questions. 1, 2, 3.
Farmers that supply, but has it been the other way around, where the impact of load shedding, like for the traders, hops is quite reliant on electricity as well? Have you had an impact where farmers are battling and that has impacted your supply for hops to you? And how much of the farms are privately owned that supply to you, and how much is SAB for owned farms that supply to you guys?
Can I take the three questions
Yep.
and then response?
Hi, Mobile from Reuters. I apologize for this, but just clarity. I think I might have been distracted. So the green shoots, so is that already happening or will start to happen from next year once we have had a full effect of the things that you mentioned? And I just want to get a sense of, so the beer, what do you call it, volumes, so down 5%. What is it, year to July? What was it pre-COVID?
And then last one.
Brian Sokutu from The Citizen. I think my question is to both Boris and Lucky. Boris, during your presentation, you briefly touched on the impact or the challenge of alcohol abuse. One has been wondering how effective has your public education drive been?
Sure. Do you want to touch on green shoots and then I'll...
Yeah, so I think the one positive is that the inflation rate is coming down already. But remember, what we're just saying at the moment is the rate of increase is slowing. Prices are not outright declining yet, right? And especially on the food price front, 9.9% food inflation, even though it's much lower than it was, it is still quite high. So I think definitely at the moment, the pressure is still very much on the consumer. The other thing to remember is that, the Reserve Bank cut prime interest rate by 300 basis points, but they've hiked back 475 basis points. So the interest rate is a lot higher than it was before COVID. Now, in our forecast, it's going to remain at this high rate for at least another 6 months. And even then, good news, it's not going up further. And yes, eventually they're going to cut it, but that also takes a lag to be felt in the consumer pocket, right? They must cut the interest rate, then our debt repayments must come down a little bit, and only after a couple of months we've got the money to spend. So I think the rest of this year, and certainly maybe also the first quarter of next year, will still be very tough. And like I've mentioned also, the fact that especially the social relief of distress grant has not been increased since 2020. If you think about 3 years of inflation, with that grant not increasing, that's probably a 20% decline in the purchasing power of that very lowest income group, especially because their inflation rates is also not, it's not the CPI inflation rate. They spend 80% of their salaries on food and transport, where we've had such high inflation. So the fact that social grants increases were below inflation, it's also still very much going to hurt the consumer for the rest of this year until next year, March, when they are going to hopefully lift the social grants. So we think things really still tough. One little bit positive is the rate of inflation is coming down, but not yet really felt so much on the consumer side. So more positives from sort of the second quarter of next year really than for the next 6 months.
Cool, yeah, I think echo that. I mean, our view is the same. So the green shoots are that, the forecasting is all that it's peaked, right? And it's potentially will start to come down. And as Lynette said, that will take significant time to work its way into the economy. Testing my memory here. Remind me of the questions, right? So beer volumes, just to clarify your point, the total liquor industry is down 5% this year. So that's beer, wine, spirits, and fabs. Total alcohol is down 5%. Beer is actually flat this year, so far, year to date. Yeah. It's not. Yeah, so on the farmers, so the vast majority of our farmers are commercial farmers. We don't actually own any of our own barley or maize farms. We do own, I think, one hops farm, and work with commercial hop farmers in George. So that's we have very strong relationships, long-standing relationships with these farmers, and we do a lot through our emerging farmer program, FarmSol, as well, for emerging farmers. But we do procure from private farmers, They've been significantly impacted, right, by load shedding, etc. And at a cost, and some of the yields have been off as a result, especially in the irrigated areas. But we are lucky. We have multiple farmers working across the whole country, so different impacts in different areas. And we do have a lot of dry land barley as well, so which is not as impacted. Obviously, the diesel price is a significant impact, but coupled with that, you've seen much higher prices for barley and hops because of the commodity prices increases globally. So I would say the farmers have, they're spending a lot more, but they, for now, earning more. They're spending a lot more on diesel and fertilizer, but the prices are a bit higher. So I would say still in a healthy place, certainly within our ecosystem. I'll let you follow. So we've been very deliberate at SAB about how we've focused on responsible consumption, right? I mean, I think we learned a lot of lessons through COVID and about how we go about it. We've launched something called SAB Sharp, which has 4 main pillars, and I'll describe them very quickly. One is about investing in the communities. We know that a healthy community where people have jobs and they are engaged, there's less harmful consumption within those communities. And so this is something we've done over a long period of time, but we are much more focused on now. So that's living sharp. Sell Sharp is really talking about, and Lucky can talk to this as well, is about working with all of our traders, so bars, nightclubs, taverners, to ensure that they are enforcing the rules that are in place, right? So we are in the process every year of auditing every single outlet, ensuring that they are providing a safe place to consume alcohol, are adhering to the rules. We do spot audits of what they're doing. Are they serving underage people? Are they breaching trading hours? Are they serving people who are visibly pregnant? And I'm proud to say that over 3 years now, we've been driving this. The compliance has improved a significant amount. It's the start, right? There's much more that we need to do. But the good thing is, and I'll let Lucky speak to this himself, is that we have complete buy-in from the taverners and from our traders, the bars, the nightclubs. They fully understand the importance of adhering to the liquor rules and doing the right things. Not 100%, obviously, we know that, but the vast, vast, vast majority of them do. And understand the importance of trading responsibly and doing the right thing, because it drives ultimately the right behavior from consumers. The other 2 things we do is just around Drive Sharp, which is helping law enforcement with enforcing drink driving. Unfortunately, all of the research says the only way you stop drink driving is by enforcement. It's the only thing that works. And so we have provided alcohol evidence centers to the likes of JMPD. These centers allow them to do roadblocks, record blood alcohol levels that are admissible in court, helps with prosecution, really helps them enforce the law, which is the only way you stop drinking and driving. And we are 100% behind. You have none for the road. You don't drink and drive. It's just something that we are very hard on. And the final thing is around marketing, right? Talking sharp, marketing in a responsible way. Where do we put our billboards? Who are we targeting when we market? We're only targeting people that are clearly above the legal drinking age through social media, billboards, on TV. We have a very strict code, which we follow very closely, to ensure that we are only targeting people that are of a legal drinking age. And we are talking about beer. It's natural, inclusive, local. It's a good product, drink of moderation, but it's not something that is going to improve your sporting ability. It's not something that does a whole lot of things that, to be honest, alcohol companies in the past were guilty of portraying for their product. So we're very deliberate about that and enforce ourselves against that code very strongly. But I'll let Lucky close just with the tavern view.
Thank you, Dr. Sokut. So we partner with SAB Sharp. Thus far, we have audited over 35,000 taverns, and majority of which were found to be trading responsibly. but we also work very closely with the new baby in town called the Drinks Federation of South Africa, which is tasked with representing the interest of the alcohol industry as far as policy is concerned. And we'll be launching an exciting project together where we're looking at providing community patrollers for communities that have been identified to have high incidents of crimes, so that we work with communities to ensure that we fight crime together, but also we pursue the interests of the alcohol industry. We also work with Aware.org, a body that is responsible for alcohol harm reduction initiatives in the country. So we partner with everyone that seeks to push the same narrative that we have, but we also have Consumer Goods Council of South Africa, which is a body that is tasked with the issues of around illicit and counterfeit alcohol, and have a toll-free number where everyone can call, to report such incidences. Because we understand that, in order to fight or to push the agenda of responsible consumption of alcohol, it is not just one party that is going to do it. It requires all of us, the industry, the society, as well as government, to come together to be able to ensure that we fight this. We know some of the underlying factors that give rise to alcohol being abused, but we're not here to talk about excuses, we're here to talk about solutions. And the solutions that the industry is doing something about it, and will continue to do something about it. There is no one who's being left behind. Every liquor manufacturer in the country has invested millions to ensure that we fight the issue of alcohol abuse in the country. Thank you.
To close on, I'd like to thank our panelists and ask them to please come off stage, but thank you very much for that Q&A session. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, it brings our third annual State of the Beer. It brings it to a close. I'd like to thank you all for being such an engaging and interested audience. It's always great to know that we are not the only beer lovers. I'd like to just say two last things. We will be having a beer tour. For those beer lovers who'd love to know how we make, pack, and distribute Black Label, Vishal and Johan will be taking tours. There will be a safety briefing because we are on a manufacturing facility, so we have to make sure we adhere to all safety protocols. I am going to ask our media colleagues to stay behind should they want to have any clarification or wrap-up questions with the panelists. So we invite the remaining audience to join the tour, and there will be snacks, eats, and treats afterwards as well. So thank you very, very, very much to everyone who's come. I really hope you got a lot of insights into our world from today. Thank you. Vishal, do you want to come up and do just a safety briefing for those who go on the tour?